shape, and form. Shape is the result of closed lines. Shape can be visible though without lines if there's an established color area or an established arrangement of objects. So a shape is created when a line meets itself, and typically that's two-dimensional or flat. Now when we talk about form, we're talking about more depth. Form is similar to shape, but it has volume and it's 3D. So primary shapes, if we go back to shapes, we've got circles, squares, triangles, hexagons, and there's a lot of psychological reactions to some of these shapes. A lot of times when we look at graphic design, we see circles meaning a unity, a whole, a group. Squares typically have a lot of foundation, a base, they're stable. Triangles are made up of angled lines, so that means there's a lot more action to them. Now when we talk about shape, we end up with space. Pretty much space is defined by the shape and the form. So we get positive space where the actual shape or form exists, and we get negative space or the empty space around those shapes and forms. I want to make note that negative space is not just the leftovers. Negative space is very important to composition. For images to have a good sense of balance, both that positive and negative space should appear to counterbalance each other. Like I mentioned, both positive space and negative space are very important to the overall composition. As we talk about form, I mentioned it's more of a three-dimensional quality of the object. And this comes from the light and the dark areas. So when light hits an object, part of that object is in a shadow. There's a cast shadow that's on part of that object. So there's light areas and there's dark areas within that same object, and that creates contrast, that creates volume. Again, psychological feelings that are associated, we tend to be most comfortable with the direction of light source above us. Above, and actually above to the left, is our most comforting light source. We can have a light source from below though. In photography, you can set up some lights. If you don't have fancy equipment, use a flashlight, use a crafting light, and throw a light from the bottom going up. You'll get a completely different dynamic in your photography. So the direction of the light source gives us some feelings. The viewer associates feelings with that direction of light source. Also, how gentle the light is or how abrupt it is. And we see that in the gradients, or that area from light to dark. Is it very harsh, or is it just a smooth, soft? So all of that kind of plays a role in that reaction from your viewer. If we pull out the color, lack of color sometimes enhances our perception of form. So when you're looking for examples of form, it might be easiest to look at some black and white photography. As we talk about lighting, there's a couple of things to note. Something called Rembrandt lighting, and that's where the light is emitted from above and to the side. And we see this especially in portraits. This creates an effect that really emphasizes the edge of the object or the person and gives us some depth. And another note regarding lighting. In landscape photography, oblique lighting, so oblique lighting, we're talking about lighting from the early morning or later in the day. So it's not a direct overhead light, it's more of an oblique light, and this really enhances natural textures. Let's take a look at some examples here. So when we talk about shape and we talk about form, with shape we're talking about where lines are creating an area. We can also have this with strong color. So don't think of everything has to be outlined. I call it the coloring book effect. We don't mean that, but we mean that there's an edge somewhere. So when we look at this example, we see some shapes obviously in the rail. There are some rectangular shapes, parallelograms there. We see it in the structure of the walls and the window. So we see shapes here. Now when we look at Edward Weston, a very famous individual that we will look at later, we see form here because now we see depth. It appears to be really in 3D. So you can have shape and space and form all together. They're just typically form throws it more into 3D with some gradients. Now when we look at, this is an example of a portrait. This is that Rembrandt lighting that I was mentioning. So look at how harsh that light is from really above and to the side. It gives a very dramatic feel. When we look at lighting, oblique lighting in landscape, what happens is that the details tend to come out. So here we see a lot more detail in those objects. Look at the leaves, look at the detail in the flower. And again, here where the light source is not necessarily coming from straight above, but more at an oblique angle, we see a lot more detail. Look at the sticks in that nest. It's very, we see lots of lights, lots of darks, lots of detail coming out. So when we talk about shape, we talk about form, we end up with space. All of those are really important, and most of them are dealing with a lighting source.